Hey everybody, this was our second lesson and I forgot to make a video for it because I had a ton of schoolwork to do before I made this and had my lesson. So I'm just going to go back and talk about this and put it up on YouTube so that everybody can have it. All right, so this lesson was on how to insert character backstory and world building details, especially at the beginning of your story, which is always a giant pain in the butt. So the main problem that people have is that they front load all of their information at the beginning because they think, well, the readers are going to need all this information in order to be able to understand everything. So I have to give it all to them now, and then we can go on with the story. Well, that is not the way to do things. Okay, and the problem with doing it like that is, one, you kill all of your pacing and your tension and your suspense immediately from the beginning of the story. Okay, so it doesn't really feel like the story begins because you've got to have a little history lesson on the character or the world or whatever before you can get into anything exciting. And a lot of readers will just not read. They'll just quit. All right, and I'm one of them. Two, readers have a predictive game that they like to play when they're reading. And it's kind of it's mostly subconscious. You don't really know that you're doing it, but when you're reading through something, you don't have all the pieces yet. You are making well, what if so-and-so is really this character's dad? Or what if, so-and-so is the murderer? And you're piecing these together based off of what clues that you do have. And then you're either proven right or you're proven wrong. And it's this little game that people are playing in their head as they read when they don't have all the answers up front that make them want to keep reading to see if they're right or wrong. And that's what helps you drive the pacing and keep your reader's interest. And then if the reader gets everything about, the example I used was Timmy. So if I had a character named Timmy who had a horrible traumatic dog incident and as a kid, and then now he's an adult and he's a cop, he's supposed to get a K-9 unit and he can't handle it because he's terrified of dogs. If you just explain everything about Timmy's fear of dogs and every incident he's ever had with a dog before you even get to the story, then the readers are kind of just who the fuck is Timmy and why do I care? I don't care. So it sucks for him, but they don't really know Timmy yet. They haven't really been involved with him and his story yet, and so they don't really care. Then there's a trope also called As You Know, Bob, which is, there's several names, but that's one of the names. And that is what kind of kills the suspension of disbelief that is required for a good story. So if two characters are talking and they're filling the other character in on a detail that both of them would already know, then it kind of comes off as really weird. It would be like if, you and I had a conversation and I was like, well, as you know, the sky is almost always blue except when we have clouds, and then it can be gray. And then at night the sky gets dark and lots of stars come out. And that might be a world building detail, but everybody knows what that looks like. Why would we have a conversation about it? But people think, oh, well, I won't put it in the narration. I'll put lots of world building stuff in conversation and dialogue to make it more interesting. And that can work if it's not something that all the characters would always already know and not really talk about. So you have to be careful about what kind of details you put in conversation. And then the last problem that happens when you add way too much too soon is that the readers cannot remember all of that information before they get into the story, especially when it comes to world building. You can't sit and explain how the whole government system works and then expect the readers to remember that once the plot gets picked up. It's just not going to happen. So, there are some solutions for this problem. One, cut everything off. Just get rid of it, okay? You don't actually need that much backstory at the beginning as you think you do. Okay, readers enjoy the suspense of not knowing all of those pieces because of that little game that they play, and they really enjoy collecting more information as they go and as it becomes relevant to the story. And they don't need to be front-loaded from the beginning. They're very happy with getting whatever basics they need to understand the current scene that's going on and then adding more as you go. So once you've gotten them hooked on the action of what's going on in the story and the plot, then you can start filling in as it becomes relevant all those details. With fan fiction, we don't really need a lot of these details because we've all played the game or read the book or seen the movie, and we know the world around it. We know certain characters' backstories. Like, we don't need filled in. Now, if you've got an OC, that might be different. But even like if we had a Dragon Age Inquisition OC, we don't need to tell the reader everything that happened from waking up in Haven and, Liliana thinks she killed the Divine and, we've already played the intro. Like, we don't need any of that. Okay? So a tip that I like to do for me is to start your story in media res. So in media res is Latin for in the middle of things. And right wherever the action of the plot starts, that's when you start your story. You do not need to have any setup or build up to it. You just start it right when the action starts. And then you fill in the reader as you go. So like Dragon Age 2 is a really good example of this because it does not show the Hawk family gathering their stuff and packing their belongings and people in town freaking out about the Darkspawn horde and them leaving the house. Like, we don't need any of that. We get immediately with them running up in the wilderness, being chased by Darkspawn with no explanation of who these people are or what is going on, because we don't need it. Okay, so you can cut a whole bunch of stuff and then just sprinkle it in as the story goes. You do not need to have a lot of it at the beginning. Another solution would be to chunk it. Okay, so instead of having a whole bunch at the beginning, you have little bits and pieces of it as you go. So whatever backstory information that you absolutely want the reader to know, you need to sprinkle it in the first chapter. Okay, so think of backstory or world building details like a game of connect the dots. All right, so you just have the dots, and the readers are more than capable of connecting those dots by themselves and drawing all the little lines. They don't need to be explicitly told that, Timmy is afraid of dogs because of his grandma's evil chihuahua, tried to bite his face off when he was a kid. Like, you can just have him walk down the street to get a cup of coffee and see someone walking their dog and like immediately cross the street and maybe almost cause a traffic accident because he wasn't looking, because he wants to get away from the dog as fast as possible. And then the reader is going to be like, well, he must really hate dogs, so something must have happened to him in the past to make him afraid of dogs. Like, you don't actually need to tell them that. And sometimes those details, especially when you have like traumatic backstories, are a lot more effective and powerful when the reader has to put those lines on the dots themselves and connect those dots, and you're not actually saying it out loud. So you can have a woman who might be an assault survivor, like, warily back away from men or, decline getting drinks at a bar or whatever. And like the reader can put those pieces together themselves. And it's actually a lot more powerful for them to do that than for you to be like, yeah, well, somebody assaulted her when she was a teenager. Like, because then it's just very matter of fact. So Dragon Age Inquisition is kind of a good example of chunking it because, you can pick your race and you get the very bare bones of like, if you're a dwarf, you're in the Carta. You don't get any other information other than that you were in the Carter and you were a Illyrian smuggler, and that's it. So you have no idea how you got to be in the Carta, what your relationship is with the other Carta members, like how you felt about having to go to Haven. Like, none of that is given to you. And then later on, through dialogue options and like war table stuff and codexes and things like that, then you get more information about Dasher and, your backstory and things like that, but it's never given to you up front. So Origins is also a really good example because, the world building for Dragon Age and Thetis was brand new in Origins, and they had to introduce all those details to us. So each time we would go to a different location, then we would get details from dialogue and conversations and codexes and little bits and pieces that we would put together to figure out what the circle is like, what Orzammar is like, etc., if you didn't have your origin there. Solution number 3 works really well. They're flashbacks. So with Timmy, we could have a flashback of that traumatic incident with the evil chihuahua before we see him, or maybe even after we see him cross the street to get away from the dog on the sidewalk, and then we'd be like, oh, that makes so much more sense. So it's a great example because you're experiencing that moment as a reader with that character, and you're not just being told about it after the fact. So it has a lot of emotional punch with it. But it's not like the solution for stuff every single time. Okay, so the problem with flashbacks is if you have too many of them, it's really hard to kind of juggle what's happening in the present and what was a flashback for the readers. All right, so they're a great tool to use, but not for every single instance of like a traumatic backstory. So just make sure that like you very clearly mark them. Like a lot of people do them in italics, or they have like a date at the top of the flashback, so if it was 3 months ago, if it was in the year 1817, whatever, so that the reader knows when it's a flashback. So that is how you can incorporate your details over time, over the course of the story, instead of front loading everything at the beginning. And even though this was last week's, episode, so to speak, you can definitely still ask questions in the class discussion about anything that we talk about from week to week.